Hello and welcome to today's webcast hosted by the Sales Management Association. Our session will start in just a few moments. First, I have a few announcements. The first announcement is to make you aware that we will not open attendees' audio lines on the broadcast today. Instead, we'd like you to submit any questions or comments that you have by text by using the small window labeled questions. It's on the right side of your webinar application window. And when you do that, your comments and questions will come to me as the moderator, and I will read them on your behalf. Also, a reminder that we'll be recording our webinar today, and we'll make it available for playback in the Sales Management Association's resource library. Our members will be able to download slides there as well. My name is Bob Kelly, and I'm happy to introduce today's session, which is really one in a series of web-based Sales Management Association presentations that feature practitioners and thought leaders in the field of Salesforce effectiveness. The Sales Management Association is a professional association for sales operations, sales enablement, and sales leadership professions. We provide our members with research, case studies, training, peer networking, and professional development. If you're joining us for the first time, we encourage you to consider membership in the association and also invite you to visit us online. We're at salesmanagement.org. I'm also happy to introduce our excellent panel, or our excellent speakers today, Scott Worstline and Ashley Borthwick from OpenSymmetry. Ashley Borthwick is Senior Manager of Professional Services at OpenSymmetry. She's led over 100 SPM implementation projects for OpenSymmetry clients. Before she joined the firm, she worked in project management for Volusion. She's joined by colleague Scott Worstline, who is Vice President of North America Sales at OpenSymmetry. Scott previously held client and project management roles with CA, Compensation Technologies, and Calidus Cloud, now SAP. Before that, he was a technology executive at Bank of America and a management consultant with Accenture. So thanks very much to Ashley Borthwick and Scott Worstline from OpenSymmetry for being with us. It's great to have you both with us. Welcome, Scott and Ashley. Scott and Ashley, are you still with us? I do hope.
Yeah. Sorry, just coming off mute there. Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Worstline, and we're very happy to be here today to talk to you about something that I know when I managed compensation was kind of very near and dear to my heart, and that was how do we make sure the end of the year consumption of the various changes for plans and things like that are integrated and rolled out really as soon as possible to the field as early in that fiscal year. So what we're going to focus on today will give you, kind of 2 minutes on OpenSymmetry so you know who we are. But then Ashley is going to spend the bulk of today's session taking you through what she's learned around helping people prepare and how to conduct, this hectic year-end activity and make sure operations keep clicking. All right, let's go ahead and advance the slides. So, up one, please. Just missed one. So real quick on OpenSymmetry. So we are a global sales performance management company, and I'll define sales performance management in a minute. But we are a consulting company. We focus with our clients on understanding what best practice looks like, and then we work with all of the products in the upper right of the Gartner Magic Quadrant to figure out what application is going to be the best fit for them. We've been in business since 2004, so celebrating our 15-year anniversary this year. And across that history, really what we've tried to do is become a very holistic service provider. So in helping people determine what applications to use, how to use them, and really any kind of way that we can help them with their sales compensation process, being able to plug that gap and being flexible with them. So really a focus of ours. Next, I'll show you a little bit on how we view the customer lifecycle, and I'll just kind of highlight how I think that actually integrates into today's conversation as well. So let's go to the next slide. All right, and so what we're seeing here is, what we consider the customer experience, or really you need as approaching major changes. Now, this is really built out for implementation of technology, because to what we're going to be talking about today is you're starting to take in maybe plan changes, ideas, help folks understand what the impacts of that might look like, both from an expense standpoint as well as how you might be able to implement that. So if you think about evaluating and planning for your your year end coming up, making sure we kind of conduct those. We're selecting what designs make sense, what align best with the corporate objective, and what's the best way to get those implemented, and kind of moving that on through the year. So at OpenSymmetry, we have teams dedicated to kind of each one of these phases. But why I wanted to put this in here today is, even though this is how we might approach a net new implementation, I think it is still applicable in how you might approach your year-end process, and making sure, again, you're prepared to take on those changes and get them rolled out effectively. All right, one more slide here as we define sales performance management. So I think it's, I'm sure all of you have seen a lot of the various marketing from different firms, different vendors. Everybody kind of has their own sort of flavor of sales performance management. So when we consider sales performance management, OpenSymmetry, we like to think about them as a set of dependent processes. And so if you look at the business processes indicated on the PowerPoint here, you'll probably notice and recognize that there's a high degree of overlap in the data that is required to support these processes. And then, as you notice on the outside of the diagram, these are really the cycles that these processes go through. As you plan for changes, you implement those changes, you manage them, and then we're analyzing the results of those changes for next year. And, that cycle is very constant. And so, again, what we're really here to talk about today is the implementation, or the integration of those planning changes. Might be prepared to implement them. Focus mainly on incentive compensation management today, but as Ashley goes through it, you'll see the tentacles and how they would apply to these other business processes as well. So again, the idea of OpenSymmetry, kind of who we are, what we do, how we view sales performance management. Ashley's going to take you through what we consider best practices, and hopefully some ideas around how to prepare for it. And as Bob mentioned, please put questions in the chat windows. We want this to be interactive, and hopefully some very actionable information coming from you all out of the session. So with that, I believe I don't see any questions in the chat window yet. So I will turn it over to Ashley, and she can take you through the approach. All right, take it away, Ashley.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today. Like Scott said, really we want to talk a little bit today about the OpenSymmetry recommendations for best practices when it comes to making system updates. So, first and foremost, create a formal stepped process here. Share any expected outcomes. Create a lessons learned, and then finally, we're just going to kind of recap with an end checklist to go over everything again. So, like he was saying, we like to think of things all linked together. So the best way to go about this is to create those logical steps and keep it simple. We take kind of a 5-step approach, or 5-phase approach, if you will. This is very similar to the typical project life cycle. So starting off with planning, supporting design efforts, development, testing, and then finally rolling it out to your sales team. So to kind of go through planning here, we have a few different inputs. The first is to build your timeline. Making changes takes time. It's best to review the changes that need to be made, and assess the time it would take you to make those changes, to test them, and then to migrate and roll them out to your team. From there, you can kind of back into a correct timeline. We also recommend getting involved early and anticipating needs. If you aren't involved in the plan design discussions currently, definitely try to see if you can get involved in those. Jump in and ensure a coordinated effort between plan design development and ongoing management. assess the level of change management. While there might be change management involved in the communication of the new plans to your field, it's also good to know how your platform can support those changes, as well as what changes the impact the changes might have on your system, and also how it will impact your payees in the long run. And then the last input to the planning phase is to have a backup plan. Given the time it takes to complete plan designs, get them signed off on, and get them into the system and migrated, it's always good to have a backup plan. That way, in case something goes sideways, you have something to fall back on. For example, maybe using draws or bringing in outside help to help you get those plan changes in place and tested in a timely fashion. Some different outputs that you might have to this step is a project timeline, an initial requirements document that kind of contains those high-level requirements, a communication plan, and a backup strategy. Once you move through that planning phase, our next step is the design phase. On this, you want to outline your goals for next year's plans. So once again, that is kind of going hand in hand with getting involved in those discussions early. That's going to give you an opportunity to proactively support the process from a data and system standpoint. The insight will be able to give you an opportunity to better understand the goals for next year's plans based on whatever strategy your company might be leveraging, and also give you time to start thinking about any data needs and development or modeling that might be needed as well. Make sure that you have data needed to make those decisions. If you don't already have a sales or program performance analytics, it's a great time to start thinking about what kind of analysis will be needed to make informed decisions about your new plans. It's also a good time to start thinking about modeling the plans. If this hasn't been done previously at your company, look at options to model the new plans out in the ICM platform that you might be using. By doing this, you'll be able to kill two birds with one stone. You'll be able to help model the plans being developed and also keep the analysis active throughout the year to ensure ongoing assessment of the plan performance. One thing to note is that most systems can handle most plans, but there's often an easy way and a hard way to build them out and to administer them. As such, you want to make sure that yourself or your SME is actively engaged so that you can know what the new plans are going to look like and provide feedback where you can anticipate any issues. Some potential outputs we have for this phase: a functional design document. So that's going to take those high-level requirements and get a little bit more granular with them on how they're going to be designed within your ICM system. Finalized timeline, as well as any anticipation on any costs that might come with this. An impact assessment kind of goes hand in hand with timeline, costs, and resources. And then a resource plan that really delves in a little deeper into what resources might need to be involved in making the system updates, how much time is going to be needed from each of them, and when they're going to be needed throughout the process. And then lastly, modeling environment.
Yeah, and one thing I highlight here, Ashley, before you go into the development, and it really kind of is, I think, a linchpin in the process of how do you move from design to development. In that, I think that normally what I've seen in my experience is that a large portion of the plan changes, might be known, might be actually be able to be finalized, while that final 20 to 25% is still in discussion, maybe still in modeling. So one of the things that I've done in my past is try to work with, the various stakeholders so that we're not holding, 100% of the changes from development before, we let people go, right? So if there are certain rules, if there are certain things that we know are going to be locked for next year, then let's try to get those agreed to and get the team working on them so that, again, we're not holding things that are known, based on some of the outliers that may take a little bit. Like quota, for instance, generally the quotas might still be being calculated as you, lock down your final month in Q4. But ultimately, that shouldn't prevent you from being able to begin configuration of the rules. And again, even if there are 75% of the changes to the rules that everybody's agreed to, being able to start work on that and then take on the other 25% when it's finalized just allows you to, make the best use of that small window that you have from when the plan changes actually get communicated to when they actually, are required for payment.
Absolutely, Scott. It's a very good point to bring up. As far as development goes, Scott's absolutely correct. That kind of goes into my second bullet point here, which is to make sure you have correct data access. Like you mentioned, we work with a lot of customers that most of the plans are finalized, but quotas, specific rates for payees, things like that might still be being finalized. Don't let that hold you up. You will want that information to be finalized sometime in the development cycle, ideally as early as you can, but don't let it deter you from going ahead and moving forward into that when those are easy little things to plug in. Another thing you're going to want to consider when you're looking into the development phase, you want to make sure that your environments are available and stable. So make sure that your development or test environments, if you have them, are ready to be used. You want to make sure that people involved in the development efforts have access to those environments, that there aren't going to be any major overhauls or refreshes that are planned for that environment that might, wipe out any configuration that you're doing. And you also want to make sure that you start getting some data into that environment so that you can use it for testing later on. Another thing you'll want to look at is the potential impact of the plans to the current BI. Looking ahead at current reporting and analytics to ensure that any changes will be accommodated in your reports. If not, planning that you're going to need to make some updates on that side as well. Consistency in plan development, this is something that I always try to stress to customers that come to me for advice on design. You want to try and group payees together, right? So if you have a certain group or role of people that fall under one structure, it's best if you can try to kind of streamline and optimize those plans so that you don't have a bunch of random configurations or formulas that might vary by person that might end up not being used and difficult to maintain. So set a standard operating procedure for your plan development and try to stick to it. And then lastly, archive plan components. Many systems will allow you to archive old and non-used components. So you'll want to leverage this to help keep your environments clean moving forward. Some potential outputs of this phase, status meetings, just to kind of give a checkpoint to any project stakeholders on where things are at, what has been developed, what's left to be developed, and the timeline on that. Feedback loop and the delivered configuration. Step 4, one of my favorites, testing. Testing is a vital part of making system updates. And it's a part that a lot of times companies seem to overlook. So the best way that you can get prepared for testing is to consider these inputs. The first is a test plan. You want to create a test plan that creates an overall test strategy. So you're going to want to come up with test case scenarios, test data, and define what is needed for SIT and UAT testing and any exit criteria. That way, when you get to this phase, you can just seamlessly go through it. You'll want test data. I typically recommend that you have data to support testing the rules in your new plans for at least one person per plan, per component, per set of logic within that component. Some different types of testing that you might want to do, boundary testing. This just allows you to test different attainments that fall on the border of a new tier or end of an old tier to ensure that calculations are working as expected. For example, is your plan designed in such a way that a deal should climb tiers as a payee works through higher levels of attainment, or are things supposed to be trued up back to $1? Things of that nature are what you'd like to test with boundary testing. One-offs, you want to test special circumstances that might not always occur in a typical commission period. So, just those random scenarios, that way you know how the system is going to handle it and how you need to handle it as well. And then lastly, you want to consider reporting and analytics. You want to make sure that your reports and analytics are connected, But also, this is a great opportunity for you to look for any anomalies in the pay and provide feedback to the design. For example, if you're doing some testing and you notice that a payee has achieved their annual attainment, within the first month or two of the quarter, obviously that might indicate that the quota is set too low and you might want to revisit that. Some potential outputs for this: a traceability matrix to trace test cases back to requirements, test scripts and results, so kind of that step-by-step guide on how to go about executing the test cases, and then documentation on the results to make sure things are working as you were expecting. And then a migration strategy. The migration strategy is needed to decide how you're going to move from maybe a dev or a test environment into more of a production environment. And that kind of rolls right in here to step 5, which is a rollout. In this, you want to make sure that your production environment is ready and available for migration. We typically recommend, if you can, use test environments. So whenever possible, do the new plans in maybe a dev environment, and then try to complete the migration process in a middle environment, such as UAT or test, prior to executing it into production. And that way you can validate that the process will go smoothly and that no dependencies have been missed. We also recommend creating a migration protocol. So if you don't already have this, establish a standard operating procedure for promoting code into your production environment. We also recommend, thinking about some sort of regression testing process to ensure that any unwanted impact on current plans can be identified early. And then lastly, you're going to have a communication plan. So either you need to create or update any employee communications in advance of the migration to let them know what to expect during that time. Some potential outputs you might have for this phase: migration of
sorry, let me jump in here a little bit, because I think, the regression testing you made a point of, and I think that that's something that a lot of people, obviously everyone has to deal with, because not all of your plans change. Maybe you give folks just a couple of other, maybe little sub bullets under regression testing, maybe what you would see as some, ways to set up regression testing or make that process a little bit more achievable, because I think that's one that generally gets, not the attention that it requires, just because they're, kind of run out of time in the day.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that you want to plan for, right? Typically, some regression testing things that you might want to do, keep in mind that in the testing phase, you've already ran through your test scripts, you've documented your results, and you know how they compare to your expected results. So when it comes to migrating code, putting it into a new environment, and then doing some migration testing, stream your data through. Look at some reports just to see if the attainment matches, maybe that initial data that you flowed through in your dev or testing environment, and then see how the payouts are performing as well. So I typically recommend, if you can, go ahead and push some extra data in there, maybe similar to what you used in testing, or if you're using production data, creating some expected results against that. That way you can just quickly make sure that everything is still working as you were expecting it to. That kind of answer your question, Scott?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the other things I was going to highlight is having, kind of a standard set of data. So I think where you were talking about making sure you have like certain months and things like that, I think if folks think about how they would prepare data for testing, and having sort of a standard set that you go in and modify, and therefore you've got, sort of known results that you can VLOOKUP essentially, right, and look for variations where you wouldn't expect it. So just different ways like that to make sure that you can take a broad look, and I think that kind of repeatable data set to me has been an interesting way to accomplish that.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, as I was mentioning, as far as outputs go, you'll have your migration of configuration. After you've done that regression testing, you're going to have a migration sign-off to say, yes, everything is migrated and it's looking like it's supposed to. And then finally, updates to those payee communication docs. So just letting them know that the migration has occurred, everything's there and ready for them to go ahead and take a look at. And then just from a lessons learned perspective, you know, as I've mentioned, it's always really a good idea to create a conservative timeline. So a lot of times, like Scott was mentioning earlier, it gets tough because you're in those plan design meetings and maybe everything's been signed off on by the, except for those quotas or rates, things like that. You know, go ahead and account for that in your timeline. Go ahead and start the pieces that you can. When little things like that, not big structural changes, those can always be updated later. But definitely try to give yourself plenty of time. Start the planning process early. That way you have an appropriate amount of time to do the configuration, do the testing, the migration, and then that regression testing as well. Hold to the process. So, you know, we've talked about this a little bit, but create a process for what you're going to do and what you need to have accomplished before you move into each next step or phase, and then stick to that. Over communicate. It doesn't hurt to, you know, be very open during that planning process, especially as a comp admin or a SME. You might be very familiar with how the system works, whereas someone that's involved in more of those planning discussions may not be hands-on with the ICM system you're using. It's good to let them know if you do foresee any issues with a plan that may not be a great fit for your system, or that might be, you know, difficult to maintain over time. It's also a good way for you to let them know if, let's say, you have different lines of business and you're trying to drive certain behavior. Give your input on how you think that might work best within the system. And then over communicate to your reps. You know, let them know what's coming plan change wise, what they can expect from, you know, the time of what the plan is, and then when it's going to be implemented and rolled out to them, and then how they can view their updated statements or whatever little changes might apply to them. And then lastly, optimize where you can. So keep those plans as streamlined as you can, and that way it just makes it faster to implement, to test, and then easier for you to maintain over time. Any questions over anything I've went over so far before I turn it over to Scott to go through a quick checklist? Okay, I'm not seeing anything come into the chat. So Scott, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is just, you know, something we sent out as more of a working, you know, again, something that hopefully is a little bit of actionable for you. So I'm not going to drain this right now, but I would do is just ask that if there was something in particular or a topic that folks wanted to hear about today that maybe we didn't touch on, if you could go ahead and put that in the chat. I want to make sure that, you know, if there was a specific need, you know, we get that addressed for you. And I'll just kind of wrap up, or I'll just kind of put a summary around this is, you know, again, it's all about working with the stakeholders, trying to get incremental progress early. You know, again, I think the main challenges I always had with it was changes coming too late, changes not backed up by data, you know, so kind of the cocktail napkins coming across and creating a lot of busy work for things that may not ever even make it into production. So I think that's where it actually talks about putting that process in place. Kind of, you know, we know you won't own every decision, but helping drive that timeline, making sure people understand dependencies, I think will go a long way in helping kind of make that part of the year for you a little less hectic. I know when I was at Bank of America, we had to have our stuff out on January 1st. So, you know, the holiday seasons were always a bit of a sprint. And so anything we can do to try to help string that out and make that a little bit calmer water for you is really the goal. So, you know, hopefully you found some things in today's session helpful. If you have any questions about sort of what we see in the industry or things like that, please don't hesitate to ping us. We're happy to tell you what we see as standards, what maybe, you know, if you have questions about how long does it generally take people to do this, other things like that. Totally happy to give you our insights on what we've seen. But with that, I'm not seeing any questions come in. So I think for the most part, we can call it a wrap. And again, thanks for your time this afternoon, and hope the information was beneficial.
Hey, Scott, it's Bob Kelly. So we do indeed have some questions. I'm saving them for you. So
okay.
if you guys could stay with us just a few more minutes. Yeah, so let me, I'll read those to you, and I'll do my best to aim these at either you or Ashley as appropriate, but I'll trust you guys can sort out who's best to answer. You're, of course, welcome to answer either any of these. So anyway, let's get to our first one. The question is actually an observation and a question from someone who says that what you presented seems like a pretty standard software implementation project, but could you provide some additional insight about the analysis phase, I guess, before you decide to implement a change like this, and how you go about determining what you should change, what parts of the sales comp plan should you change, and sort of how you arrive at that decision.
Sure.
Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the main thing is kind of deciding what behavior you want to drive, right? So just an easy example here, but, I work with a lot of companies, and perhaps, in the past, they've had kind of a general tier structure, and they want to start focusing on bringing in new business, right? So perhaps they change their comp plan so that there's a higher, rate associated with new business, so that reps are more inspired to go out and get higher commissions off of chasing those new business. Maybe they have additional kickers or higher attainments if they exceed their quota by so much, or perhaps if you want to drive, very large accounts, giving them an additional spiff or kicker if they bring in a business over a certain amount of money, for example. And then you might have some people like account managers who are more focused on existing business, but you don't want to deter other sales reps from kind of maintaining that as well. But they're just not going to see those higher commission rates and overall payoffs from that. So really it's about figuring out what kind of behavior you want to drive, what kind of business you want to bring in, and then really evaluating what motivates your sales reps to achieve that.
Good. A related question.
Sure.
Yeah, a related question about other possible triggers that would suggest it's time to change the comp plan. So the one that you mentioned is pretty clear. That's where this firm's strategy or the sales organization strategy has changed. So it's sensible that the incentive comp plan would want to change to reflect that. What about situations where the comp plan may not be performing very well against the sort of established strategy? How do you know if that's the case, and are there specific triggers to indicate that it's time to update or modify the plan in that situation? And by the way, I'm paraphrasing this question to sort of suit what you've already said. So to the questioner, please respond if you'd like to follow up on this, but please, Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, take a look at how people are doing attainment-wise. So assuming that you're a company that has different attainment thresholds and tiers, if it's kind of a sale plan, is everybody year after year achieving their quota but not necessarily exceeding it, and just kind of doing the bare minimum to get into those higher commission tiers? If it's not working, are people just not coming anywhere close to their goals? And if so, maybe evaluating the goal numbers themselves. So did you set it too high, or is there a shift in the market where maybe that particular line of business just isn't doing as well? And if so, maybe shaking up the plan and putting in a new focus and new rules around that. I think a lot of it comes to looking at how your current payees are doing and seeing if they're just kind of maintaining year after year, or if they're completely missing the mark, and also if they're exceeding. So for example, when I was talking about testing there and looking at reports, if you have a lot of payees that are just really hitting their attainment tiers a lot faster than you're expecting, maybe your goal setting was too low and you need to increase those quotas. That's going to help you push your reps to sell more over time, and also save the company a little bit of money by not getting them into those accelerator tiers so early.
Yeah, good. Obviously a complex question. I'm sorry, Scott, go ahead, please.
Yeah, two things I'd highlight on that. So back to the original thing around the kind of standard project methodology, and sadly that's, one of the things that we see people not doing is taking a different course on how they roll out these plan changes and doing it a little bit more ad hoc. And maybe because it's in Excel, we don't, pay attention or, do that same due diligence. And I think that's what gets people in trouble. So that is why we want to kind of reinforce that rigor around it. And then what's different for IC is, again, how can we break out some of this and get it in chunks? Now, I think some of these other questions are becoming a little bit more design related in the mechanics of the plans, and how we would look at the performance of that plan to determine whether the plan is doing what you wanted it to. And I think Ashley hit on a couple of good ones there. Is how do you know if it's quota versus your plans are too complicated? And really, this session was not intended to talk about sort of trigger points for changes in design and what might, kind of, again, focus on that motivational factor of the plans versus the operational side of it. So we tried to focus a little bit more on the operations side today as opposed to, the design aspect. But Bob, maybe we could take a look at that as maybe an additional follow-up.
It's a great topic for another session. Let's give some thought to that. Well, if it's all right with you guys, I'll move on to the next question. This one I like because it sounds like it might be trying to get you in trouble a little bit. They want you to maybe name some of your favorite technologies. The questioner asks, I understand that you're holistic, I think meaning by that you work with a lot of different firms, but you must have experience with dozens of technologies. Do you have a top three of the best technologies that you work with? Or also, do you have, can you recommend specific technologies based on complexity or company size?
Yeah,
obviously, they'd like you to rank your supplier partner firms, which of course would get you in lots of trouble. So I like a questioner who is interested in stirring things up a bit. So I'll let you now tactfully respond.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. So let's see. So, as I mentioned, we work and have partnerships with the software vendors in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So just to draw a box around the people that we have working knowledge of. And so when I say working knowledge, that means we've implemented them. We really know how the under the covers works. And so when I think it comes down to really what the organization is trying to accomplish, a lot of what we're seeing now is people wanting to drive more business autonomy. And by that, I mean having greater control over the actual configuration, and moving that sort of out of, maybe what would traditionally be an IT role or a back end or, different things like that, maybe something more akin to what the person is doing in Excel today. So really kind of trying to mash those two things together. And in my mind, there's really only three enterprise products that really enable the end users in that way. And we tend to agree with Gartner on those. So if you look at the top right, I think those are kind of the usual suspects if you want business autonomy. Anaplan, I would chunk in there as well, especially if you have other use cases, can be a good fit. But then when we start getting into the Oracles and the BQuams and some of the other ones, they tend to be a little bit more technical in how you would actually do the configuration. Now, so that's kind of how I would draw a line through the applications. If you've got ones that are going to be business supported and you've got some that are not. And so depending on which direction you're going, that can be a main direction, determination of which way you would go. Now the other
let's do names if we can, Scott. So I'll do that part, I think, because those would be those top three that you mentioned would be SAP, formerly Calidus Cloud. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, it'd be yeah, exactly. And IBM. Yep, that's right.
Yeah. Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I would put Anaplan in there. Anaplan is still not like a purpose-built application, so that's how I differentiate a little bit around Anaplan is, and if you know the application, super cool technology, but not a purpose-built application like the three I just mentioned. So again, there can be some lines of, obviously, devil's in the detail. The other part that I would highlight that can be a big determination on which solution ultimately is a good fit for your organization is your dependency on territory and quota. So some organizations have a good process around territory and quota, and that really just becomes a source of data for incentive compensation management. And that, and you have a little bit more straightforward. So there's more options in products that do that. I think tightly integrated around territory, quota, incentive, like for medical device, for instance. We know that there's a tight correlation between those business processes. They change every single month. And so depending on sort of where your need is, that's going to ultimately drive some of the product options for you as well. But we're happy to sit down and have a conversation with you if you're looking or you've got, again, some questions. We're happy to sit down with you and talk to you a little bit about what might be a best fit for you.
Very good, thank you. Let's see, next question. Scott, we'll stay with you on this one if this makes sense. The questioner would like to know what trends you're seeing related to compensating sales teams.
Yeah, so it's and I kind of associate this with the increase, the CRO role, right? And maybe I think this is where this is going, is you've got teams now that are really responsible for getting revenue out of accounts, and therefore we're seeing more integration of an outside seller and them being maybe on the team with customer support and even an account manager. So that's definitely something we're seeing more of, so that folks are looking kind of at lifetime profitability of the customer. And what we see, and again, kind of back to some of the complexities that can drive, is, okay, well, how do we manage the assignments? How do we know who roles for what effective dates and who should get credit for what? So that's where we're seeing some complications with it, as you start to see, especially from a customer service standpoint, are they going to get the same phone call all the time or not? Are we going to allocate them? So there's some questions there around how do we, drive that teaming, again, without losing the individual motivation. So, as far as how people are doing it, everybody does it a little bit differently. But I think the key is, how do we make sure that the outside seller doesn't walk away from the account, not focus on, more tail revenue, and how do we create that kind of 360 view of the customer through the compensation application? Because one of the things that we found is unique in the organization is, there's very few other areas where you're going to have all of your transactional, all of your order data, all of your assignments. To me, that's really where the ICM data becomes a gold mine. And then if we don't have technology wrapped around that gold mine, it takes that data and makes it much less valuable. I think the saying right now is data is the new oil. And if your data is all hemmed up in spreadsheets, you're just not going to be able to mine it.
Great. Well, we are both out of time and out of questions, so I'll draw our proceeding to a close here. But I'd like to really thank you very much, Ashley Borthwick and Scott Worstline from OpenSymmetry. Really appreciate your insights and being with us today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. And before we sign off, I'll take a moment and remind our audience that our next Sales Management Association webcast is December 6th, when we'll host a session on how competency-based learning contributes to sales readiness at FedEx office. You can learn about this session and many other sessions on our website at salesmanagement.org. I'm Bob Kelly, Sales Management Association Chairman. Thanks again for your time and attention today. Goodbye until next time.